Good afternoon, everybody, and please can I welcome everybody to this meeting of the Central Winchester Regeneration Archaeology panel on Wednesday, the 26th of July from the Walton Suite, Winchester Guildhall. The time is 2 p.m. My name is Councillor Martin Todd, chairperson of this meeting and leader of the council. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording will also be available on YouTube after the meeting. So please can I ask everybody here to make sure their mobile phones are on silent. And it's particularly important to use microphones when talking because that's necessary to get recorded and onto the video. In the unlikely event that it is necessary to evacuate the building, the fire alarm will sound. Please follow all the instructions given to you by our team. If you are joining us online, please make sure your video and sound are switched off. There is a section for questions later in the meeting. When we get to that point, please use the hand raising function and we will invite you to ask your question. Before we move on to the agenda, I'd like to start by asking the panel members and our guests here today if they could introduce themselves so that you know who's here. So which side should we start on? Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Paul McCulloch. I work for Pre-Construct Archaeology. Our company, PCA, has been appointed to carry out the archaeological evaluation of the CWR bus station sites.
Hello, I'm Keith Wilkinson. I work for the University of Winchester, and the organisation which I lead, Archaeology, we did an earlier phase of work. We drilled some boreholes, which I will tell you about probably again with many of you later in this afternoon's session.
I'm Nick Thorpe, and I am the head of the School of History and Archaeology at the University of Winchester, and I'm a member of the Archaeology Advisory Panel.
Hello, I'm Tracy Matthews and I'm the archaeologist for Winchester City Council. I lead on advising on archaeological issues to do with planning, redevelopment, research. I run the Historic Environment Record and I'm a member of the CWR Advisory Panel.
I'm Martin Todd, I'm leader of the council, and this is my favourite part of the job.
I'm Martin Biddle. I've been involved in the archaeology of Winchester since 1961 on the site of what was going to become the new Wessex Hotel. And it's really been the main part of my archaeological life ever since. And I'm very proud and delighted to have been a part of it.
I'm Patrick Ottaway. I'm an archaeological consultant for various commercial developers and public bodies. And one of those public bodies is the City of Winchester. And I've been advising the council, and Tracy Matthews and I have been working together on the archaeological works at the Central Winchester site. My archaeological career began in Winchester, in fact, when I was appointed as the Assistant City Archaeologist for the Museum Service. And since leaving Winchester to go on to other things in York and elsewhere, I have maintained my interest and contact with Winchester's archaeology. So, for example, I was the author of the Urban Archaeological Assessment volume, which came out a few years ago on Winchester, and I've been involved with other publications of archaeological work in Winchester as well.
Hi, I'm Warwick Smither. I'm Development Director in the Jigsaw Consortium, working with the Council to bring forward the Central Winchester Regeneration Project.
Hi, I'm Tamsin Trail. I am the Regeneration Director, also part of the Jigsaw Consortium.
Thank you. I'm Varian Lyons. I work at Winchester City Council as Head of Programme for Delivery of Central Winchester Regeneration.
Thank you all very much indeed, and very, very grateful on behalf of the City Council to have such an eminent and expert panel here, but also a panel that I know from walking around and looking at the dig that's going on earlier is not just eminent and expert, but still so enthusiastic about our city's archaeology and the new discoveries that are set to be made as part of this project. And I'm also grateful to our guests from Jigsaw who are here from the first time, and also the enthusiasm I can see that you also feel for this area of work and your commitment and interest to it. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you, council officers, also for all the work that you've done to prepare the meeting and that you do in building our partnership with our archaeological colleagues. So moving on to the agenda, and we've slightly touched on what we're likely to be talking about already today. I'm doing the bit at the top, the introduction from the leader. We'll then move on to a recap of the work undertaken to date and the findings so far from the borehole study and radiocarbon dating, and that will be done by Keith Wilkinson, as he explained earlier. Then Tracy Matthews will be taking us through introducing us to the background, the aims and objectives of the trial trenching programme, and Paul McCulloch from PCA will be taking us through the locations, the timetable, and what's been happening so far, particularly exciting. We will then have a discussion with the panel in the room on what we've heard, and then there will be a public question and answer session where, as I'll remind you when we get there, then put your hand up and we will call you to speak and contribute and ask your questions. So the first substantive element of the agenda, a recap on the work undertaken to date and the findings so far. Keith.
Thank you. Thanks. So this is just a recap that many of you will have heard the original at least once, maybe twice before. So in 2020, Archaeology were commissioned by the City Council to carry out a borehole survey of the central Winchester regeneration area. In fact, we did that survey alongside PCA. They dug the test pits through which we then drilled the borehole. And this slide, the bottom part of the slide, shows the test pits being excavated in the Lower Brook Street car park on the left. And then we have the drilling rig that we use to drill the boreholes to the rear of the bus station on the right-hand side. And then the central picture there shows one of the sides of the test pit excavations. So we did that field work in August and September 2020, and then we went on to do various analytical works of the cores that we recovered. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the position of the boreholes. So they weren't evenly distributed through the central Winchester regeneration area, which is shown in blue. I think it's a slightly older version of the plan of the regeneration area. We obviously could only drill boreholes in areas that were not occupied by buildings. So that meant that there is a focus towards the east of the study area, as well as in the Lower Brook Street car park, and then outside the Brook Shopping Centre, so the southeast corner of the Brook Shopping Centre, and in King's Walk area as well. So the boreholes were extended from the base of the test pits, which were 1.2 metres deep, and they extended all the way to the bedrock geology, the chalk geology, which varied around about 5.5 to 6.5 metres below the ground surface. Once we'd drilled boreholes and extracted the cores, we then carried out a monitoring exercise looking at variations in the water table over the course of the year between September 2020 and September 2021. And we found that the water table varied between around about just under 1 metre and just over 2 metres below the ground surface. And unsurprisingly, the water table varied according to the amount of rainfall in the catchment of the River Itchen. Next slide, please. We produced a series of models which show the layers at different depths below the ground surface, and the illustration on the left-hand side shows these models. I'm not going to go into any of the detail, but the sort of take-home findings are that archaeological deposits extend to around about 4.5 metres below the ground surface in the eastern part of the study area, in the area of the bus station. And then to the the west of the study area and the north of the study area, they're somewhat shallower, perhaps about 3 meters below ground surface. The samples we extracted from the boreholes, we looked for the preservation of organic materials, and we found that throughout the archaeological deposits, the organic materials were well preserved. And by organic materials, I mean wood, plant remains, pollen, etc. So all the sorts of materials that we would look at to try and reconstruct past environments and past subsistence economies, what people ate, in other words. The sort of conclusion of our study is that the most likely impact of any development of the Central Winchester regeneration on the archaeology is likely to be a result of mechanical damage caused by piling, digging of foundations, service trenches, etc. And it's very unlikely that any development is going to significantly alter the water table in such a way that, for example, this site loses water content and the organic materials deteriorate. Now, that's all. I've reported all of that before. So as a result of the meeting that we held here last July, we were commissioned to do one last piece of work on our borehole samples. And that was to obtain a chronology, in other words, to try and find out how old these various deposits were. So in the intervening period, we have carried out a program of radiocarbon dating of samples that we've taken. And also one of our students at the University of Winchester had done a project on the pottery that had been recovered from the boreholes. And this very complicated illustration attempts to bring everything that we've done, so that's the borehole record showing the layers, the pottery data, which are the various symbols represented in blue, purple, red, green, etc. And then the radiocarbon dates, which are the numbers written on the diagram. Now, I don't propose to go through this in any detail whatsoever, but just to give you a general idea. So the green at the bottom, the sort of green area marked on the bottom of all the boreholes, this is the chalk, this is Cretaceous, this is 90 million years old, it's of no archaeological interest. We then have the river gravels that sit above that, which we didn't try and date using radiocarbon. And then we come to our first archaeologically interesting layers, if you like. And these are the peats which we find throughout the centre of Winchester. This peat formed at the edge of an earlier floodplain of the River Itchen. And the radiocarbon dates that we've obtained show that the peat in the northwest of the site, that dates to around about 8,000 years ago. So 8,000 years ago would put us in the Mesolithic period in archaeological terms. However, the peat further to the east is somewhat younger, and it's around about 5,000 years ago, which puts us on the boundary between the Neolithic and the Mesolithic period, so slightly later. And this shows that the floodplain of the River Itchen moved around in prehistory, and that's recorded in where these sort of back swamp environments are located. Another aspect of central Winchester that has been detected in previous archaeological excavations, notably in the Brooks, is the tufa. So the tufa is a carbonate-rich deposit that forms in river channels, in humid, so warm, temperate, but wet environment. And it's never before been dated, but through this current project, we've been able to date it. And it dates between around about 5,000 and 4,000 BC. So it's firmly a prehistoric deposit. It was there several thousand years before the Romans got there, and it coincides with the development of the later peat. So it's just another feature of the River Itchen floodplain during the Mesolithic and the Neolithic period. That then is overlain by alluvial deposits, so floodplain deposits, and these, interestingly, are a lot later. So there's a big time gap between about 4000 BC and around about 200 BC, when we have no evidence for what was happening in the central Winchester regeneration area. There's all sorts of possible reasons why we don't have that evidence that we might discuss, but it's just a break in the sequence. And these first floodplain deposits that we recognise in the boreholes date from either the late Iron Age or the early Roman period. And then they extend all the way forward into the later Roman period, and indeed even into the early Saxon period. And that's quite interesting, because at the same time, the city of Winchester has developed, and the red colour that you see towards the top of that diagram, this represents the archaeological layers. And these archaeological layers begin forming in the early Roman period, unsurprisingly, and then they extend all the way through into the Middle Ages and obviously into the post-medieval period as well. You'll notice that there are thicker sequences of archaeological deposits in the eastern part of the site, precisely where the current evaluation is taking place, and that a large chunk of those deposits, perhaps half of them, are of Roman and Saxon date, and virtually all of the deposits that sit beneath the water table, which is marked in blue on that diagram, that thick blue line, most of the deposits beneath the water table are of Saxon and Roman date. I think I'm going to leave the chronology for the time being now and wait till questions to talk any more about the details. So I'll pass on.
Thank you very much indeed. Ms. Matthews.
Thank you. So why are we doing this project? Next slide, thank you. Following the borehole project, and in conjunction with the decision to undertake the carbon dating to add information, Winchester City Council decided to commission some early stage intrusive trenching within the CWR site. In part, that's because there's very little information or previous archaeological work in this part of the city. Lots has been theorised and anticipated about what might be below the site, and the borehole project gave us key insights into the general nature and the depth of these underlying deposits and strata below the site. But there's no detailed information on things, for want of a better phrase. So we came up with some initial plans on what could be undertaken, and the panel endorsed this approach. Following a detailed procurement process, PCA were appointed to undertake that work, which is currently ongoing. Next slide, please. As with all archaeological projects, we had some very important key aims and objectives, both general and specific to the site and its archaeological potential, as we thought. For this project, we had a number of key aims and objectives were devised. This included investigation of all significant archaeology within the trenches from the 19th century and earlier. We wanted to obtain detailed information on the nature, date, preservation and significance of that archaeology, and enable this information to be considered in the context of the borehole data currently available. The information will also be of great value in the future to inform redevelopment proposals and decision making. Next slide, please. Some of the detailed aims and objectives were based on key themes and research agendas set out in previous documentation: the Winchester Urban Archaeological Assessment, a previous desk-based assessment compiled specifically for the Central Winchester Regeneration site, and regional research frameworks, amongst many other documentation. Key focuses were deemed to be pre-Roman deposits, as Keith has been alluding to in his slides, the origin of those deposits, the water lane silts and alluvium, peat, tufa deposits, all of which can contribute to our understanding of past environments, the dynamics of the river valley and local topography. An interesting data fairly close to the CWR site has indicated a buried late Iron Age land surface, and one of the questions is whether there's more potential for that and archaeological activity associated with that, and how that might relate to known archaeological sites in the area like St Catherine's Hill and Orams Arbor enclosure. The Roman townscape is a huge area of research focus too. Early Roman occupation is known in the upper parts of the city, on high grounds around St George's Street, Jewry Street, for those that know Winchester, and also in some of the higher ground found in the Brooks areas. We wanted to understand how the landscape and water is managed in this part of the town and enabled the growth of the Roman town across the CWR area, we hope, to understand that and to begin to understand and confirm the Roman street layout and buildings, etc. There's some evidence from Winchester of earlier Saxon occupation and activity, and a small cemetery through excavations led by Professor Biddle in the 1960s. Is there more potential in the abandoned Roman town for archaeology and activity of this period? Alfred's late Saxon burh and the medieval and later town, we have huge potential to confirm and undertake research into the development of tenements and the street plan in this part of the city, understand trade and industry, how people lived life in the town, what they ate, what they had, and of course to link that to the hugely rich archaeological documentation, which brings key insights into the properties in this part of the town, and for later periods to bring those maps to life with physical remains. I'm going to hand over now to Paul from PCA, who will give you a bit more detail on the project and the preliminary works to date.
Thank you, Tracy. So the slide you're looking at now on the left-hand side just explains the dimensions of the trenches and the essential arrangement of them within the bus station and between Coitbury House and St Clement's Surgery. So the first trench on the near St Clement's Surgery is one which we've just started excavating, and over the coming months we'll be moving over to the eastern part of the site to investigate trenches 2, 3 and 4. It's been commented that the trenches are relatively small given the much larger area of the bus station, which is thereabouts. But is the case when we come to arranging an investigation like this, we need to account for all sorts of things, where we put our spoil heap, how we can accommodate the continued operation of the bus station, and where we can keep our tools and equipment, and so on. So what looks to be quite a large area quickly becomes quite confined. The 4 trenches then have, apart from being relatively confined in that area, also have very particular targets that Tracy has just alluded to. So the work that we started just in the last few weeks started a couple of weeks ago by getting the site set up. So if you've been in the area, you'll have noticed the fencing going up, and perhaps the delivery of plant and cabins that we're using. And on the 10th of July, we actually began by opening up trench 1 next to St Clement's Surgery. And you can see here on the slide what I've referred to as the big orange trowel being the first piece of equipment to be used, which assists in taking off the modern tarmac and the layers of modern gravel underneath it. So this trench is where we're working at the moment, and over the project duration of approximately 4 months, we'll be dealing with this trench and then the 3 trenches in the eastern part of the site behind the bus station offices. Eventually, we'll be handing the trenches back to the City Council to allow some resurfacing works to be undertaken so that the car park can be reused and so on, and allow the site to return to some kind of normality, or I think they phrase it meanwhiling, while plans are brought forward for the rest of the development. In the course of our work, we'll be attempting to engage as many people as we can in all sorts of activities related to what we're finding and what we're processing, and on what we'll be reporting. So I think, as was alluded to before, once we've finished our work, and once we have processed all the fines and environmental samples that we would have taken, we'll be preparing a report. There will be a short interim report which will attempt to summarise the sort of the main points before we get a report out within about 6 months of completing the work on site. And I'm made constantly very aware that we do need to turn around that information, because it's absolutely essential to inform the city and its development partner Jigsaw as to what the archaeological implications are for their proposals being brought forward. So what's been happening so far? As I say, we got our machine on site to take off the modern deposits in the area of Trench 1, and this has been undertaken under the supervision of Shane Maher, who is more usually located on sites in London, but PCA decided that we really need to send somebody to site with considerable experience of the type of work that's being undertaken. So Shane has come down to supervise here and bring, therefore, the weight of PCA's experience to bear on the project. Next slide, please. So straight away underneath the modern tarmac, on the left-hand side, you can see that in our rectangular shaped trench, you can see some bricks, and beside them a line of sort of, if you like, curved bricks. These form a little gully, and the bricks form an alleyway that lay here and was used in the 19th century. This alleyway lay behind a set of buildings, which you can see on the right-hand slide, Forders buildings, a terrace, roughly speaking, where Coitbury House now stands. So the good thing about this is that we can tie our archaeological works straight away into the historic mapping, which kind of helps us know where we are and be sure where we are right from the onset. Next slide, please. So the team have been getting their hands dirty now that we've taken off those modern deposits, and we've been clearing away some of the Victorian rubbish and debris that was left behind. And I think there's a short video that can illustrate the recovery of a little glass vessel from a rubbish pit that was backfilled with rubbish in the 19th century. And for clay tobacco pipe enthusiasts, the slide on the right, the image on the right is of a very finely decorated pipe bowl, and these can be very readily identified by the decoration they carry, and they can be tied down to their manufacturers. There were at least 2 manufacturers I think we know about in central from Winchester, and perhaps this was a local product, or perhaps somewhere further afield. So in the course of the work, once we've taken away the Victorian remains, we can then excavate to a deeper level to find out what type of deposits that there are, and whether they are of great significance, and we were, I think, pleasantly surprised to find that within less than 1 metre of the tarmac, we've come down onto remains of a medieval building and perhaps its yard surface behind. And this is very interesting for us because these remains are well preserved, and they demonstrate the enormous potential that Keith's borehole suggested would be here. It appears that we were immediately able to put some flesh on the bones of those boreholes and fill out the story in more detail. So here you are looking at on the in the middle portion of the slide, our trench number 1 with about halfway down. I think you can make out some chalk blocks that have been stuck together using a very orange mortar, which is very characteristic of medieval buildings in the town. So that's perhaps the rear wall of the building that fronted onto Tanner Street. And so when we start talking about buildings and property boundaries and the definition of properties in the archaeological record, we immediately think, well, can we compare this with the documentary evidence? And so here we have a building. Can we compare it to documentary evidence? Do we know who was in that house in the medieval period? And we probably will, which is a great way of tying up archaeology and history together. Yeah. So yes, and just a short video showing our supervisor Shane getting to grips with the cobbles in the back of the medieval yard. So as part of our project, we want to, as I said before, engage as many people as we can in what we're doing and let people know in various ways about what we're finding. So on our open day, our first open day, which is coming up this Saturday, we will have some display boards up around our gathering point in Abbey View Gardens. And those display boards will tell the story of the history and archaeology of Winchester and of our part of it in the bus station area. Along with the display boards and that open day, we are hoping to be able to encourage people to see our trenches as we progress on subsequent open days in September and in October. We'll also be keeping people updated through a press release every week that will provide information to the City Council's website and our own website, and we'll be also linking those to our social media and as I say, pages on the City Council's website. We'll also be inviting some groups to visit the site, such as the Hampshire Field Club and their members and others too who have perhaps a special interest in the town and wish to come and see what we're doing. And both during and after the work on site, we'll be offering talks on the results of the work. One thing we are doing is going to try and encourage people to participate in the processing of finds and the processing of environmental remains that we recover from the trenches. So we have an online system for doing that, which you can find via our PCA website. I think the app is called Calendly, and I think you can see the link there on that slide. But do have a look at our own website to find that link to sign up if you want to volunteer. There are limited numbers. I think there are some vacancies available in August, but it's looking like it's pretty booked up in September and October. So there's a lot of enthusiasm being shown for those events. think that's it from me.
Thank you very much indeed. So the next part of the meeting is where the panel, if you have any questions you'd like to ask each other to clarify either on the borehole discussion or the initial trenching.
Yes, I do.
Patrick.
Yeah, well, very interesting to see the results of the radiocarbon dating. I have, I suppose, two questions. First of all, you've shown, which I think we probably knew already, that the water table had rose during the Roman period and the Anglo-Saxon period. And I'm wondering if there's any particular period within that range which you can identify as being critical in terms of the rising water table, or is it just a sort of gradual process that takes place throughout, I don't know, 1,000 years or something like that? Secondly, if I understand you correctly, there are parts of the site as a whole where alluvial material is being deposited through the Roman period, indeed into the late Roman period. And I'm wondering whether you've been able to sort of plot that in such a way as to suggest that perhaps there are parts of the site where we wouldn't now expect to find Roman buildings, or indeed perhaps any sort of occupation until perhaps, I don't know, the Norman conquest or something like that.
Okay, thanks for those questions. So on the first one, I think I should introduce a caveat. There are only 3 dates on the flood deposits, the early historic flood deposits. So, I could come up with some really intricate model of how flood deposits have accumulated, but I've only got 3 points in time. So what I would say is the earliest flood deposits that we have are from the easternmost extreme of the site, in what's now the bus station, the area to the east of the bus station. However, in that area, the flood deposits are very, very thin. They're only about 30 centimetres thick. So the thickest sequence of flood deposits occurs in the Tanner Street area, actually, in the where we've got maybe 3/4 of a metre, which also the lowest part of that dates to the very early Roman period, but we're talking 1st, 2nd centuries AD, if memory serves me correctly, and then it goes through to the late Saxon period. So we've got 2 points of time there, but I couldn't indicate to you when the greatest accumulation was, whether it's in the Roman period or the Saxon period. I've sort of forgotten what the second question was. Oh, areas of the city that might be flooded. But as I say, the Tanner Street area, I think, has got the sort of between Tanner Street and King's Walk is where the thickest deposits of that alluvium were. So that area was clearly flooded frequently, and sediment was accumulating in those flood conditions. There are flood deposits to the east under the bus station, but they're much, much thinner, and rather in that area, archaeological deposits seem to dominate. So people were clearly active in that area. So I would say Tanner Street for the flooding, less so elsewhere. And there's no evidence for flood deposits in, for example, the Lower Brook Street car park and the area around the Brooks.
Well, thank you for that. As far as the as far as the dating of the flood deposits are concerned, this is new information, isn't it? This is something we haven't known before. We haven't had information about the late Iron Age, if you like to call it that, and the immediate early Roman period in terms of flooding and deposition of alluvial material. That would be correct to say, wouldn't it? This is new.
Almost correct to say. I think this is the first time it's been dated comprehensively, because I keep referring to the radiocarbon dates, but the ceramic study demonstrates the same thing. So we've got a single sherd of late Iron Age pottery from these flood deposits, and quite a bit of Roman, slightly less Anglo-Saxon pottery from them as well. We have 2 other pieces of dating evidence for the same unit. We have a date from 165 High Street, which is an Iron Age date of similar flood deposits. So our current data confirm that Iron Age date and shows it's a continuous layer, but also in the area that is now being developed as medical practice in Upper Brook Street. We have a radiocarbon date of Saxon radiocarbon date from flood deposits there.
Yeah, I've just got something to add on that, or just to sort of bring to the table, is I'm looking at this data, and I've had the luxury of having had access to the report before this meeting, and just considering some of the thoughts around the deposits and the dating, and I'm finding it interesting because the deeper flood deposits in the sort of central part of the CWS site seems to tie in with previous work undertaken by Professor Biddle's team in Lower Brook Street and the former museum service in the Brook Shopping Centre, where they had shallower archaeology to the west and northwest, and then it was dropping off into those deeper sort of alluvial deposits, as it were. And I'm also looking at that section that you showed on the slides, where there seemed in the very eastern part of the site, the CWR site, to be deeper archaeology and less floodplain deposits. And I'm wondering whether it could be some of that lower potential archaeological deposits, it's got material in it, could relate to potential land reclamation. We certainly have, from a site in the Cathedral Close a number of years ago at the Pilgrim School, where previous borehole data had identified Roman artifacts and ceramic building materials, and there'd been an assumption that there's a Roman building in that area. When archaeological work was done to in relation to a new preschool and a new swimming pool, what was actually found was that artifactual material was in context that had been deliberately placed for land reclamation, the theory being that was the best interpretation of those deposits. And that's in the same sort of plane, north-south, as this edge of this site. And I wonder if there's an element of that going on, and maybe if we can get that deep, our trenches will tell us that a little bit.
Rachel, do you think you can go back the slides? We show that cross section. It might help other people online to visualize. So yeah, Tracy's talking about the area on the right-hand side of this diagram where you've got those very thick deposits shaded in red. I think I don't know is the answer. It's very possible that that you could have Roman reclamation, and of course that's where PCA's trenches are going to go. So hopefully we'd find out. I mean, the trouble with the boreholes is the sample window is, I don't know, I'm showing my hands, about 11 centimeters wide. So you get a very narrow sample, and it's impossible to tell when you're drilling through an archaeological layer whether you're drilling through a pit fill, a sort of occupation deposit, a bank, or you don't know what type of archaeological level it is. As in the borehole core, you need a much bigger window, which is why the current evaluation is so important, that it'll help explain the type of archaeological feature that the borehole is recognizing in a very broad way. So hopefully we'll be able to tell and address that hypothesis. One thing I will point out is one of my colleague, Nick Watson, he suggested that one of the reasons we might get these thick archaeological deposits in the east as opposed to the area of the tufa is because tufa cannot be compressed. So it's survived to its original height, but of course peat is made of organic material and it's very soft. And it's readily compressed, as is floodplain deposits made of silts and clays. They can be compressed as well. So his idea is that the area in the east is is effectively we've got those tufa equivalent surfaces have been compressed, and hence why these later deposits are able to accumulate to a greater thickness in that area. One other point I should make about this slide is that one of the boreholes, I mentioned this on the two previous talks I've given here, borehole number 8 on this diagram is drilled through what we think is an artificial channel which ran along Middlebrook Street. So we've now managed to date that channel, which its origins seem to be Roman. So that's of interest.
I don't know if we have other questions on Keith's work. Well, I've got a couple. There's an implicit question that came up here, which is, and maybe this is something that will be answered at a later date, is what we're seeing with the water deposits, or is that a rising water table, or is it actively managed? I mean, is something going on here? And what sort of scale is it? Is it, for example, might it be the old route of the river, or is this a smaller amount of water that we're talking about? I mean, might have they been managing the water for, I don't know, agriculture or fish cultivation, or defensively, or I don't know, aesthetically, did they do that? You know, and create a moat around a building or something? What is it? Is it man-made, or is it, what's going on here?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I don't know, is the short answer. A few points to bear in mind. First of all, in terms of what we know about rainfall during this period, there's no known increase in rainfall during the late into the Roman period and Anglo-Saxon period, so it's probably not a climate aspect. It might be something to do with land use. During this period, of course, the landscape surrounding Winchester and then the catchment of the River Itchen is the vegetation is being removed or progressively removed. So it's a well-known fact that by the time of Doomsday, only 15% of England is woodland. So with the loss of that woodland cover, then I think the water is going to be transferred to the river valleys much more rapidly. So that I guess there might be more water around for that reason. Other points to bear in mind is that the water table, some of this intrusion of waterlogging must have happened after foundation of the city and after construction of the various city walls. So some of this flooding was taking place within the city for whatever reason. Some of it predates that, but some of it's during the city, and certainly some of it is of Anglo-Saxon date. So, you know, we know that the area, the Upper Brook Street car park, which is northwest of the Central Winchester redevelopment area, that has evidence of flooding in the late Saxon period, and the evidence here suggests that in the central part of the Central Winchester redevelopment area, there's flood deposits there. I can't say whether it's deliberate or a product of mismanagement or deliberate management. I don't. It's not possible to say on the basis of the borehole evidence. I haven't answered your question very well, have I?
No, I think you've given Paul a project, basically, haven't you? So, no, I mean, genuinely interesting. I think that would be quite surprising to people, the idea that inside of the city walls you had this. I mean, we do have open streams now, but they're very managed and culverted. And what you're describing, presumably, is of a scale that would be bigger than that and less controlled. But we don't know why, or whether it was deliberate, or we just know it's there at this stage. Is that a fair summary of the situation?
Yes, that summarises it. The only thing that, as I say, the only area that I know, I don't know, but I can be reasonably sure is deliberate, is the area that was sampled in the King's Walk borehole number 8 on this slide, which, because it's a continuous sequence of flood deposits, it must represent a channel, because there's nothing intervening. So that's why I think that particular borehole has sampled a channel which remained open possibly from the Roman period all the way through to the Middle Ages. The rest of it, it's more transient, I think.
that has a different character to an explicitly designed channel. But are there other forms of water management that you can compare it to, like water meadows or I don't know, defensive moats or?
I mean, there's nothing big enough to be a defensive moat. I don't think in the boreholes, but we might just have missed the moats because the boreholes are, they look quite closely spaced on that diagram, but that's artificial. There's big gaps between boreholes in reality, as I showed in an earlier slide. So we might have just missed those features. But in terms of just the thickness, there's only one of those boreholes which has got a real thickness of flood deposits and where they're continuous. All of the rest, they're relatively thin and discontinuous. So that suggests to me that it's not a permanent feature. It's just something which is ephemeral, has happened, and then it's gone away. It's been dealt with if it's accidental.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Keith? Got one last one, which is when you're talking about peat, I mean, presumably we're not on the scale of like a peat bog or something. This isn't something that people would have been digging up and trying to burn or something like that.
Well, the peat disappears. The last peat is Neolithic on this that we've found. There's later peat elsewhere in Winchester, but not in the central Winchester regeneration area. The thing to say about the peat is, at the moment, the thickest peat that we have in the boreholes is 30 centimetres. But as I said, it's really readily compressed. So that peat might have been a metre thick in the Mesolithic period, for example, and it's been shrunk. So yeah, and it would have represented a peat bog. That's exactly what would have been present during the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. And what I was trying to explain earlier was that peat bog moves around different areas of the Itchen floodplain depending on how the river moved itself during the Mesolithic and the Neolithic period, possibly the Bronze Age as well. We don't have any evidence of the Bronze Age from this area. So yes, it is peat bog, but we have no idea whether people cut peat in the Mesolithic to use it for fuel or in the Neolithic either.
Thank you. Well, thank you. We whole series of questions there. Now I think it's Paul's turn. So I don't know what questions people have for Paul and the early results of excavations that he presented.
I'd like to ask some questions about beginnings and endings. I mean, obviously, something happened in the first decades, the first century AD, which led to the site of Winchester emerging as an early form of urban settlement. And likewise, another set of features operated between 350 and 450, which led to the decline of the factors which caused that focus. And I'd like to know what archaeological approaches you think might be used to investigate these periods of commencement and ending, and to what extent we might actually be able to do that.
This is where I fall on my technical task, which is to produce the information for you to perhaps discuss those points on. I'll give you the information and we can have the discussion afterwards. But I'm not sure what we would do to find out that detail. What we want to try and do is see whether there's specific archaeological data in the top of the alluvial sequence or the floodplain deposits that might help us provide some sort of chronology for the events, because I'm not quite sure we do entirely understand what that sort of late Iron Age into Roman period chronology is in the bottom of town. Does the alluvium contain any of that story, or is all of the archaeological story post-alluvial? I don't know whether that helps an awful lot answering that question.
Yes, they're very difficult questions, but they're very difficult questions, but they are the fundamental questions. And I would have thought that we should be trying to develop approaches, including the selection of sites, which might be able to throw some light upon why this particular point became suitable for emerging as a concentrated settlement. Let's not say an urban settlement, but a concentrated settlement. And equally, what factors operated to decrease the attractiveness of that centre between, as I say, sometime in the century 350, 450, and then, of course, its re-establishment, which is equally interesting, and in fact, in some ways, even more interesting, its re-establishment in a period which I suppose, broadly, one's going to have to think in terms of urbanization between, well, sometime in the 800s and sometime in the 900s. Something's happening. So how can archaeology be used to address these fundamental questions?
Could I comment on that? I've just comment. I might just comment on that, Martin. I think the sort of questions you're raising are things which have. I mean, these are not new questions. These are questions which you've addressed and others have addressed on a number of occasions. And I think we should see Winchester in the context of urban sites in Roman Britain as a whole. Really, there was a period when urbanisation started to take place throughout the Roman province of Britannia. And there are some fairly well-known, as it were, reasons and origins for these towns. Some places have a military origin, for example. And as far as Winchester is concerned, one of the debates we've had is whether there was a fort here in Winchester in the middle of the 1st century.
That's a real question.
Which then, as in other Roman towns, became the basis for an urban settlement. Now, it strikes me that in the evaluation work that is currently in hand, and in evaluation work which may take place in the future of this site, we have a chance of addressing that question again. And I think that's very important. And if we can finally nail this question of a fort, that would be very, very useful.
There are certainly a few hints in the valley floor of something of that kind.
Well, we shall see. I mean, it did occur to me that the channel, the Roman channel, Keith, that you referred to, which came in borehole 8, was it? That might have gone through a Roman fort ditch, actually.
Yeah.
But only further investigation will determine that. And as far as the later Roman period is concerned, again, Martin, these are, as it were, national questions about the reasons for the declines of Roman towns. And again, in the evaluation work that we're doing, I think that looking at deposits which date from the middle of the 4th century through to into the early Anglo-Saxon period, and the environment that they tell us about, and the sort of, as it were, the economics of the settlement at that time will be very important. And we do have a very good chance, I think, of getting a real handle on that now, using methods which perhaps weren't available when you were doing your excavations back in the day, and indeed at the excavation that I did as well in my time here in Winchester. So, as far as I'm concerned, I think the questions you're raising are very important questions, not just for Winchester, but for Roman towns generally. And I think that with the sort of current methods now, the new methods we've got, we have a very good chance of getting to grips with them in the evaluation work that Paul's team are doing at the moment, and in further work as well.
I hope so. Yeah.
So no pressure, Paul. Just out of interest, because I think you touched on that in your presentation, because we have more flexibility in the nature of the site, we're going quite a lot deeper, aren't we, on trenches 2, 3, and 4 potentially? Is that right? In terms of how far back in time could that potentially take us? I suppose that's the idiot's questions, but
I think if we knew the answer to those questions, we might not need to dig the trenches. But we are trying to find things that are partially understood as the potential, but then there's a whole load of other things that we don't know about that will also come to light and be found. So there will be new questions to ask once we've actually undertaken the work about information we are yet to find. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I think I was just you know, we're going down 4.5 meters, which is really quite deep. I mean, when we were looking at that plan there, so I don't know how far. It slightly depends. How does that cross-reference with the
Bullholes.
the boreholes? How deep is 4.5 meters? I don't know, just roughly, I suppose.
It's 4.5 times deeper than the trench you saw this morning. And that poses some really considerable sort of logistical headaches about how you get to that depth, what bits of kit you need to hold the sides of the trench up to make it an attempt to get down that deep, that viable. And then once you're down there, to be absolutely certain that the deposit that you're looking at, you can properly date and sample in a way that means it's not contaminated, it's not there's not deposits in, you know, it doesn't contain things which have been intrusive into it. So that if you get down that depth, you've got to be absolutely certain that the deposit you're looking at is secure in stratigraphic sense and secure in terms of containing the information that you want. So if we get down that deep, it'll be great, but it'll be highly targeted, the effort that we make.
And with, as we've heard here, some potentially exciting questions to answer, or new exciting questions to create.
Well, yeah, we will find things that ask new questions, but they will tie into some very traditional themes, and themes that aren't just about the formation of the city, but the formation of the city and its relationship with the Upper Itchen Valley. Because I think there's a much wider story than just the city, and the city really was I see it as the sort of hub of the production, agricultural production of the Upper Itchen Valley. So the two goes together really, the chronology and development of the city, but also the chronology and development of its economy, which was a rural economy in the Itchen Valley.
Any more questions? Oh, yes.
On a similar theme to the one we just touched on, but moving much later in time, could you say a little bit about the potential implications of the findings so far in the one trench that's open in terms of the nature of activity in the city before the Victorian period and after the medieval period? So I suppose kind of 1500 to 1800.
I don't know that we have a great deal of archaeological evidence for that period to date.
The lack of it is what I'm thinking of, may surprise people.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we understand something of the archaeological record, but certainly of the historical record that suggests that decline in the town sets in and areas of the town become effectively, I don't know about abandoned, but their use changes dramatically from the intense occupation which we witness in the earlier medieval periods, and well documented and mapped understanding we have of those streets, to a time when there's very little going on the sort of peripheries of the town, which appear to be turned over to meadows, certainly along Upper Brook Street and Middle Brook Street, and turned over to orchards and other activities which aren't intensely urban in the way that we understood them to be, perhaps in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries.
Can I ask another question? What extent do you think that our attempt to understand the various stages through which the city has passed should be entirely dominated by reaction to the destruction of archaeological deposits by modern development, or should there be, in fact, carefully constructed research programs to address these fundamental questions, which are not being answered by these chance excavations, such as is the potential of the site we saw this morning? It may be very exciting, no doubt, but at the moment it's not a problem. But should we not have research programs to investigate the origin and development and changes in human settlement in Winchester, independent of the chances which are offered by the destruction of deposits?
think that's a much wider question than Winchester could answer, because we're talking about the planning system that's set by national government, how archaeology has been undertaken in the last 30 years. Certainly, development-led archaeology can and does deliver key research-led investigations across the country, and we certainly see research questions and agendas leading any investigations within the city, and including the CWR site. Some of them that we've discussed just now, including the really important research questions you were alluding to. I think, personal opinion, I think it's really difficult for anybody in this day and age to deliver large-scale research excavation, particularly in an urban area where you're looking at multiple landowners, difficulties of water and depth like we have in Winchester, without development. That's a very personal opinion, and not said as an employee as the city council. So I just want to stress that one. But I certainly fundamentally believe that any archaeological work, be that done by a university, by a local society, be that by required of a developer, has to have responsible, ethical origins, and that includes research questions.
Thank you. Any other related questions? I guess, I mean, that, dare I say, it might even be a question which Nick has to address. I mean, what is the situation with funding councils and things like that? Are the days of enormous, central government funded archaeology? There's a lot of laughter coming from the academics here at this point. I'm hearing that maybe the world is not, the funding environment is maybe not as generous as once it might have been.
I think that would be a fair statement of the situation. Yes, I mean, the nature of sort of central funding of research has changed significantly over the last decade or so, in terms of the amount of money available and the degree to which that funding is directed to meet government interests. So kind of pure research is, not the main priority today, I would say. So yes, it's not. There aren't obvious funds to which we could apply for that kind of the scale of activity that would be necessary. And I think my own view in terms of the suitability of carrying out the kind of work that's being done on the site at the moment with sort of inexperienced student labour, it wouldn't be appropriate from the archaeological point of view, and it wouldn't really help the students much, because I think it would be the likelihood is that they would just find it a bit overwhelming if that was your first fieldwork experience.
Paul, you wanted to comment?
I'd just like to observe that this project in particular, perhaps more than many I've been involved in over the years, represents that chance to bring research questions to the design of the work. And I'm your contractor, but I also am a resident of the town and would like to congratulate the city for the approach that's been taken so far, because really I feel this project and the Jigsaw project and the Regeneration is putting archaeology front and centre, with major research questions to be asked about the work that I'm doing. I think that's highly beneficial. Good.
Thank you for that. I believe Paul Bennett, who is another member of the panel, has joined the meeting online, and I don't know if he has any questions that he'd like to ask. I realise I apologise for not giving him any notice of this, but
not so much questions, but parallels. There are significant parallels between Winchester and Canterbury, particularly in terms of the development of flood silt and pasture within the post-Roman town, within the walls of the town in particular. Something like 46% of the total inner area of Canterbury was covered with pasture and areas of ground that were flooded on a regular basis, to the extent that they were not subject to any form of occupation other than the pasturing of animals, and in a slightly later period as allotments. And it wasn't really until the 13th century, 12th, 13th century, that they received any level of occupation at all and any form of development. And that situation sort of starts in the late 3rd, early 4th century, and was prevalent particularly in the 8th and 9th century, when we've got some significant charters that discuss these areas of land to the west of the city. So there are particular parallels there that I can observe. In terms of development, almost every single development in my time, latterly, have research questions attached to them. Whether it's an evaluation or an excavation proper, and any form of archaeological assessment needs to be attached to some form of research design. I think this is sort of current practice now and is not unusual. There really are very few opportunities to get outside funding. And it is the principle of the polluter pays that pays really for archaeological work to be done. Using the term research tends to arch eyebrows, but in fact, all the work we're doing is a form of research. We are extending our knowledge of the past by excavating, usually in advance of destruction. And here, a significant amount of research is being undertaken in order to determine what levels, what important archaeological deposits lie beneath Winchester, and how the development is to be managed on the basis of our knowledge of those deposits. I hope that helps.
Well, that's very, very interesting, and I will look at Canterbury through new eyes. And I think that idea that there was things going on inside the walls other than buildings is certainly, for me as an amateur, one of the most fascinating elements of what we've talked about today. Whether it be rivers or streams or gardens or allotments or pasture. So very, very interesting and exciting. I look forward to hearing more. Are there any other questions that we have?
It's not so much a question, Martin, but I think it's worth, from our perspective, just putting our pennyworth in that. First of all, I'd congratulate the council on its attempts to explore and give the opportunity for the archaeological exploration that's currently ongoing. And I rather think that we should see this as an opportunity. And I don't think that the development we're going to ultimately bring forward should be seen as completely destructive. We want to respond and recognise that which is identified and referenced, and see whether or not we can actually use it to advantage in terms of design, layout, configuration, and even exposing things which we discover and make them part of the scheme. So it seems like we're the bad guys almost, if I dare say, and we're perceived as being the people who are going to come and destroy and concrete over and such like. No, we're in this together. We're here today because we recognise the importance of the work that's being undertaken. We see it as part of the process, part of the development process, And I just wanted to convey that to this group, but also to the wider audience.
Thank you, that's appreciated. And one of the elements that we've talked about and that's in the Central Winchester supplementary planning document is about opening up the waterways. And it turns out that we may be going back to a longer historical tradition than perhaps we realised when that went into the SPD. Are there any other questions from the group? But thank you very much indeed for that comment. And I sort of touched on it at the beginning, but knowing that you are also as interested and committed to the results of this work is greatly appreciated. I think the next section on the agenda is the time for public questions. So those of you, well, I was going to say those of you using Teams, you're all using Teams. There's a little button at the top of the page with raise next to it and the sign, an icon of a hand. So if somebody would like to ask a question, please click on that little icon and I will call you to ask your question. I'm not seeing any hands. I mean, there have been a lot of very interesting questions from colleagues on the panel, but we have a hand. There we go. Why is it showing me the hand? Right. So okay, here's that. Right. Kim.
Do you want to see me or just to hear me?
Feel free to switch on your camera.
That's a bit just as a matter of courtesy. Sorry, good afternoon to you. Sorry, I just thought I'd help you out to get the thing going. I think this is one for Paul. Good afternoon, Paul. In the ground penetrating X-ray thingy that I commissioned some time ago, in where you're doing the dig in Coitbury car park, it showed, or there seemed to be an indication of potentially a row of columns where you're now digging. It was somewhere between a metre and a half below ground. Is that now, in fact, that you've discovered, or could there be something below the gully that you've yet to discover? That was my first question. I've got another quick one if you understood the first one, that is.
Hi, Kim. Yeah, my first question back was going to be what depth was that slice at that you had the columns? You thought there were columns?
Yeah, I mean, you've seen the study, haven't you?
Yes, thank you. You did send it to me some time ago. So were you thinking that those columns or foundations were at about a 1 metre or 1.5 metres, or
somewhere between the two, roughly there? Yeah. Have you got to that depth yet, or are you still working towards it?
So the deepest part of the trench is 1 metre below the tarmac at the moment. So, but we do have a test bit that was done preempting the boreholes, which went down to about 1.3 below ground level, and both that test bit and the trench as it's currently the depth of the current trench firmly in medieval deposits. So
right.
At some, the depth we are now, and in that test pit, it's solidly medieval archaeology.
So you're still going to keep going for a while yet before you draw any conclusion?
That's right. Yes, I would expect Roman deposits to be quite a bit deeper than we are at the moment.
Right. A second point is I just want to put a quick advert in for my wife, who runs Heritage Open Days, which runs in mid-September over 2 weekends. And if you're going to be holding exhibitions, it would make sense to tie in with what they're doing, because they get so many more, they'll advertise far and wide and you'll get a bigger audience. So after this event, I'll send you details of that and see if there's a way you can tie in with that Heritage Open Days, if you know about it.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. That would be great. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, for bringing that up. That's very helpful. And yes, lots of exciting archaeology still to come. Any other hands? we have a second one. Deborah Jordan, please ask your question.
Hello, everybody. I'm just a member of the public, and I wanted to know, I pass over the Coitbury site quite often, and I'm often having to look through the blue plastic just to see what's going on. And I'm really interested if we could possibly, as a member of the public, have a bit more visible access. Would that be possible? I can see it's PCA's plastics that are covering the fencing, and I appreciate, obviously, you know, they might need to have it covered up at some point, but it would be quite nice to actually be able to have a little view. Is that possible?
Hello, Deborah. Yes, that would be possible. We've got our first open day this Saturday on.
Yes, I'm going to that. Yeah.
Would you be able to come along to that?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. But
Okay.
I'm just at the moment. I'm just looking through, you know, a little peephole.
Yeah.
When I'm passing by.
So on Saturday we'll take you inside the fencing.
Oh, that'd be fantastic.
And show you the trench properly and explain what we can see.
Yeah. Yeah. Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Any other questions? No? Any final thoughts or comments from fellow panel members?
I'd just like to say, keep an eye out for further open days. Obviously, more trenches are planned, so there'll be more to see, more information to come out. Keep an eye on our social media and PCA social media, and yeah, spread the news. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, can I just, on behalf of the City Council, thank the panel for all their work, and well, firstly, I probably need to thank Keith and Paul for doing the work, and their colleagues as well that have helped them, but also the panel members for contributing to very interesting discussions about the rise and fall and rise and decline and rise again of Winchester. Let's hope we can avoid fall, although based on historic precedent, that may be harder than it looks. And also some of the fascinating discussions about the different ways that the city has been inside the city walls, and what we have the potential to discover there, and questions of finding the original Roman fort, if there was one, and other such things. So I think we've covered a lot of rich and interesting ground during the course of today's discussion. I'm very grateful for the expertise that we've had brought to bear, and for the work that's been done. And I look forward to the open days and to our next meeting, where no doubt there will be, well, might be a bit presumptive to say some of the questions may be answered, but we will know more, and we will have learnt more about our wonderful historic city. So thank you all very much indeed for coming, and I look forward to seeing you all at a future occasion.